Propose that we now go into public session. Is that agreed? On behalf of the committee, I'd like to apologise for keeping you waiting for an hour. We had a piece of legislation which took a little bit longer than planned, so apologies for that. The purpose of this morning's meeting is to receive an update on the preparations for Brexit in relation to health. So on behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome to our meeting this morning from the Department of Health Mr Jim Breslin, Secretary-General of the Department, and Mr Muireann O'Connor, Assistant Secretary, Research and Development and Health and Analytics, and Mr Eamon Quinn, a Pharmacist. From the HSE, Mr Dean Sullivan, Chief Strategy Officer, Mr John Swords, Head of Procurement, and Ms Paula Keown, Assistant National Director, EU and North-South Unit. And also Mr Sean Flanagan, Head of Primary Care Reimbursement Services from the HSE. And also from the Health Products Regulatory Authority, Dr Lorraine Nolan, Chief Executive, Ms Rita Purcell, Deputy Chief Executive, and Mr Lawrence O'Dwyer, Scientific Affairs Manager. I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I also wish to advise you that any opening statements you have made to the committee may be published on the committee's website after this meeting. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside of the Houses or an officer either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Can I now ask Mr Breslin to make your opening statement? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting the Department, the HSE and the Health Products Regulatory Authority to assist you in your examination of issues arising from Brexit. Our discussion today builds upon previous engagements and indeed the committee's own valuable report on the subject. The Department, along with the HSE and the HPRA, last appeared before you on the 30th of January to update you in relation to preparedness of the health sector for Brexit. A lot has happened in the intervening period, including 2 extensions to the withdrawal date and the election of a new British Prime Minister. So your invitation is timely as we finalise our preparations for the likely possibility of the withdrawal of the UK from the EU on the 31st of October. No less, I'm sure, than committee members, many of us have developed a fascinated nightly addiction to BBC Newsnight and its dissection of daily Brexit developments in London. However, I can assure you that regardless of those developments, the preparations of the Irish health sector for Brexit have been underway for 2 years now, and we are working assiduously to undertake as much further preparation as possible in whatever period remains. I can assure the committee that Brexit preparation continues to be a foremost priority for the Department and key health agencies, and very significant further work has been undertaken since we last met. When we last discussed the subject, I said that Brexit preparation was an exercise in damage limitation for Ireland generally and for the health sector specifically. Had we a choice, all of us would instead much prefer to devote our intensive efforts to addressing the lots of positive opportunities that exist to improve the health of our population. However, while we all hope that negotiations will be successful in resolving the threat of a no-deal Brexit, we must continue to work with industry and other stakeholders to protect public health against every eventuality. This year we have committed over €10 million in funding to health sector Brexit preparations, and if Brexit proceeds on a no-deal basis on the 31st of October next, it will be necessary to incur further costs this year and on an ongoing basis. We could do much to improve our health services with this money, but instead we must use these resources to mitigate any potential Brexit impact on population health. Neither is Brexit a temporary or a once-off adverse event. It represents permanent change in many aspects of daily life, encompassing how we trade, import and regulate goods and services, including health-related products. Previously, I outlined to the committee the structures we are using for that preparation. These remain in operation. In summary, we have a Heads of Agency group where I meet with the CEOs of the HSE, the HPRA and the Food Safety Authority of Ireland on a weekly basis to review progress on Brexit preparedness and to consider any new issues arising. The Brexit Operations Team, which is chaired by Deputy Secretary-General in the Department, is comprised of senior officials from the Department and its agencies, and also meets weekly and works to resolve issues and to escalate them to the heads of agency group if necessary. The Operations Team has a number of groups active in addressing particular issues. 2 multi-agency expert groups are working to verify the assurances and contingency planning in place in relation to the supply of medicines and medical devices, respectively. These groups, which include clinical expertise, are working with suppliers to assess the vulnerability of products to supply disruption as a result of Brexit and making further preparations to ensure continuity of care for patients. A communications group chaired by the Department is leading communications with relevant stakeholders and as part of Government's overall communication strategy with the public. As I said at my last appearance before this committee, our greatest protection against Brexit is our membership of the EU. The Department and the HPRA continues to work very closely with the Commission and with other Member States to mitigate the worst effects of Brexit and will continue to do so. The additional time granted by the extension to a possible Brexit on the 31st of October has been used to deepen our preparedness. We've reached out to all parts of the health sector, including industry and suppliers, patients and healthcare professionals, to understand the challenges they face and to work together to resolve them. I would like to acknowledge the cooperation we have received across the sector in this work. We will provide detailed information to the committee on this work throughout the session, with a particular focus on the areas you've requested in terms of the supply of medicines and the movement of health professionals between Ireland and the UK. In this work, our overriding concern is to ensure the protection of public health, the continuity in the provision of health services and the maintenance of existing services. Our membership of the Common Travel Area with the UK also provides certainty to Irish and British citizens resident in the other jurisdiction in relation to access to healthcare. The Irish and British governments have committed to the shared objective of maintaining the CTA arrangements, which have long facilitated Irish and UK residents in accessing health services in each other's jurisdictions. Provision has been made to ensure the arrangements necessary to maintain health service cooperation after Brexit. Part 2 of the withdrawal of the UK from the European Union Act 2019 will underpin the continuity in the provision of healthcare in the event of a no-deal Brexit. This will see the maintenance of current arrangements for access to routine, planned and emergency health services for UK and Irish residents and visitors in the other jurisdiction. It also includes North-South and East-West health cooperation on access to specialist health services in the other jurisdiction. In relation to North-South health cooperation, we are committed to protecting the many areas that the health sector has engaged on a cross-border basis upon. These well-established and widely supported arrangements make life easier for people living along the border and also allow for the best use of resources for both health systems. Examples include cancer care at Altnagelvin Hospital, paediatric cardiology services in Crumlin and cross-border ambulance services. The Department has been in regular contact with the Department of Health in Northern Ireland in relation to the commitment of both governments to ensure the continuation of North-South health service cooperation. These contacts build on many years of positive cooperation. In all of our preparations, we've been able to build on this very strong spirit of collaboration in the interest of patient care at clinical, hospital, administrative and political levels. The HSE has been tasked with addressing GDPR and any other issues arising at an operational level with their counterparts. In fact, the Northern Ireland Department of Health officials are due to visit the Department for a further meeting in early October. What I can say with confidence is that all existing North-South health cooperation will continue, including arrangements with Northern Ireland health service providers. Safeguarding the supply of medicines and ensuring continuity of care for Irish patients is of utmost importance. The EU has a sophisticated regulatory framework for medicines and medical devices, and detailed preparations are in place across industry and regulators as the UK leaves this system. Lorraine Nolan from the HPRA will outline this in more detail. Ireland is at the end of a very sophisticated supply chain when it comes to the importation of medicine and medical devices. My colleagues from the HPRA and the HSE will provide detailed updates on the current position and contingency plans in relation to supply security. We are working closely with the pharmaceutical and medtech industries to modify supply arrangements and minimise potential disruption. Ireland is unlikely to face general medicine shortages in the period immediately after the 31st of October. Any emerging supply issues will, in the first instance, be dealt with from existing supplies held within the domestic distribution chain. This supply chain is different to that of some other markets, including the UK. It is important to reiterate There are already additional stocks of medicines routinely built into the Irish supply chain. This is different to the wholesaling model which operates in the UK. The pharmaceutical industry and wholesalers have provided direct assurances that they are confident that they will have sufficient stocks to bridge any initial issues at ports should they occur. There is no need for hospitals, pharmacists or patients to order extra quantities of medicines or for doctors to issue additional prescriptions, as doing so could disrupt existing stock levels and hamper the supply of medicines for other patients. Patients should continue to fill their prescriptions in the normal way. As I have said, strong general assurances have been received from industry, but an expert group is also examining categories of medicine where it is deemed especially important to work directly with suppliers to verify that robust contingencies are in place. Unfortunately, medicine shortages do arise from time to time and are a feature of health systems around the world. Ireland has an existing multi-stakeholder medicine shortages framework in place, coordinated by the HPRA, to help prevent shortages from occurring and to reduce the impact on patients and healthcare professionals by coordinating the management of potential or actual shortages as they arise. The health system is therefore well placed to deal with any additional shortages as a consequence of Brexit should they occur. Brexit is likely to herald changes in our medicines market as we will be less integrated with the larger UK market. Therefore, our focus on this issue will continue well past any Brexit date and into the medium term. Work on the medicine shortages framework and the involvement of clinicians in contingency planning give us an enhanced capacity to respond to any such market developments and, for example, mean that should particular products no longer be available, expert clinicians in the respective medical specialties concerned will have identified equally effective alternatives. The committee asked about the recognition of healthcare qualifications. The Department has coordinated work across government to ensure that the Department of Education has coordinated work across government to ensure that, as far as possible, arrangements will be in place to maintain recognition of UK professional qualifications. The importance of this work as part of affirming the right to work under the Common Travel Area was acknowledged in the Memorandum of Understanding signed by both governments. At the outset, it is important to say that decisions on qualification recognition that have already been made under EU directives will remain valid, and existing recognised health professionals will therefore be able to continue to practice in either jurisdiction, subject to normal compliance with all regulations within that profession. In respect of new recognitions, the recognition of qualifications in the EEA is carried out through the implementation of an EU directive. The directive provides a mechanism for the exchange of information on professional misconduct as well. It applies to all regulated professionals, not just those in the health area. When the UK leaves the EU, either after the transition period if it occurs or on the withdrawal date, UK qualifications and the qualifications of UK nationals will no longer fall within the scope of the directive. Instead, Irish health professional regulators have third country recognition routes, which apply to qualifications which are obtained outside the EEA or which are held by non-EEA nationals. These regulators have considered these third country recognition routes with the objective of ensuring efficient routes for recognition of UK qualifications, while ensuring that this is done in an objective and non-discriminatory way. The Irish health professional regulators are satisfied that they can continue to recognise UK qualifications within approximately the same timeframes and the same level of application fee as applies currently, but now under this different legal basis. Similarly, the UK has preparations in place in respect of the recognition of health and social care professions, which will enable Irish qualifications to be recognised in the UK in the event of a no-deal Brexit. Irish regulatory bodies have also been linking with their UK counterparts to develop protocols for transferring personal data in accordance with GDPR. Transfers of personal data by Irish regulators to their UK counterparts may be required in the processing of recognition applications or in the conveyance of disciplinary information. As part of the whole of government preparations, the Department has worked in close partnership with the Food Safety Authority of Ireland, the HSE, and with the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine on the issue of food safety in the context of the UK's departure. Enhanced staffing and procedures will be in place at the ports to facilitate inspections. In order to avoid unnecessary delays, it will also be vital that industry prepares as fully as possible, and significant outreach has been undertaken with industry. Businesses will need to familiarise themselves fully with all relevant customs procedures and ensure that all necessary documentation is properly completed and submitted in advance. In conclusion, Chair, we have engaged extensively with suppliers both in their industry groupings and on an individual company basis in respect of their individual products. We have stressed to them the importance of providing early information on any emerging issues, and for our part, we have assured them that we are in problem-solving mode. We are focused on preempting or solving problems using pragmatic solutions, and we will be there to troubleshoot with industry issues that arise in the days and weeks following Brexit. In conclusion, I am satisfied that the health sector is working well to prepare for Brexit. We are linking in with central government to ensure that all cross-sectoral issues are identified and resolved. We are working with industry, including the pharmaceutical, medtech, food industries and private health service providers, as appropriate, to ensure that the health sector, our employees and citizens are well prepared and protected as far as possible from adverse effects of Brexit. Thank you, Chairman. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Breslin. And now can I call on Mr. Dean Sullivan from the HSE to make your opening statement. Thank you.
Invitation to attend today to discuss Brexit preparedness. As the committee has been advised before, an HSE Brexit planning group has been in place since 2017 and has been working closely with the Department of Health and other stakeholders on a range of Brexit contingency planning and mitigating actions. The focus of this work has been on Brexit implications across a range of key work streams, including continuity of patient and client health services, cross-border and frontier arrangements, emergency health services, including, as Mr. Breslin mentioned, the National Ambulance Service, public health matters, environmental health services at ports, workforce issues and the recognition of qualifications, continuity of supply of goods and services and associated procurement arrangements, GDPR compliance and communications. In relation to the continuity of patient and client services, the focus of the mitigation measures is on ensuring that updated service level agreements and memorandums of understanding are in place in relation to specific areas of healthcare, such as paediatric organ transplant. The HSE's EU North-South unit is working to ensure that services currently available to people living on both sides of the border continue to be available post-Brexit. These services include cardiology and radiotherapy services at Altnagelvin Hospital, and again, as Mr. Breslin mentioned, the specialist cardiac services provided on an all-Ireland basis for children at the Our Lady's Hospital in Crumlin. A detailed mapping exercise has been undertaken between the two jurisdictions, and this has produced an agreed list of all services being provided. In addition, the Memorandum of Understanding, signature of the Common Travel Area in May, has been very helpful to underpin services in this regard on an ongoing basis. In relation to emergency services, the National Ambulance Services here and in Northern Ireland have updated two key memoranda of understanding between the respective services. Firstly, an understanding on the provision of assistance in the management of and resourcing of emergency and urgent calls, and secondly, an MOU with regard to a declared major incident mutual aid, which joins both jurisdictions in the response to a major emergency. The HSE's Environmental Health Service is engaged in ongoing discussions with the Departments of Health and the Department of Agriculture in relation to the import and export of foodstuffs and the possible divergence of food regulations and controls. Significant additional resources have been put in place to strengthen the Environmental Health Officer service capacity in this regard, with nearly 100 additional staff recruited to posts. In Dublin Port and Rosslare Port, work is now near finalisation, working with the Office of Public Works in relation to new accommodation facilities for both new and existing staff, and that accommodation will be completed before the end of October. Training has also been taken forward for both new and reassigned staff. The workforce implications of Brexit have been examined by the HSE's Human Resource Department, and regulators have confirmed that no delays or additional costs relating to UK qualifications are expected post-Brexit. There is also no significant risk envisaged to the supply of UK qualified health professionals. With regard to the provision of goods and services such as medical and surgical supplies and medicines, a particular risk for the HSE arises in relation to the supply of medical devices. A number of suppliers have confirmed that the transfer of certification files from UK notified bodies is not complete, and given the lack of capacity within the EU27, this will not be able to be completed by the 31st of October or for some time after that. The number of medical devices that have regulatory issues is significant and represents a particular risk to maintaining service continuity from early 2020 in the event of a no-deal Brexit. To address this issue, we are taking in additional stock in these vulnerable product lines and looking for alternatives that don't have certification issues. In addition, we have supplied the Department of Health with examples of particular devices affected so that the matter can be considered in the context of seeking appropriate derogation for a transition period. A joint working group between the HSE, DOH and HPRA is engaged in intensive work which involves the identification of suppliers of critical medicines to obtain assurances in relation to their continued intention and capacity to supply the Irish market post-Brexit, and assurances have been received in this regard from all relevant companies. 6,500 medicine line items were reviewed by clinicians and pharmacists to identify vulnerable product lines. Assurances have also been sought in relation to existing supply routes, and while assurances have been provided, including confirmation that customs requirements have been considered as appropriate, there remains a potential for some delay and disruption to supply routes, for example due to delays in transitioning the UK land bridge or in UK airports. The key supply chain challenges in the short or immediate term are likely to be related to medicines with a shorter shelf life, those with refrigerated supply chains, compounded products and time-critical logistics. A strong focus has been put in place to mitigate these challenges, which include putting in place alternative supply arrangements, working with suppliers to increase stock in certain vulnerable areas, and also putting in place arrangements with revenue colleagues to fast-track vulnerable product lines through customs. With regard to vaccines, a 2 to 3 month stock is held in the HSE's National Cold Chain Service, which, with the stock held already by companies in Ireland, gives us approximately a 6-month supply to ensure continuation of service delivery. None of our vaccines are sourced from the UK. In terms of GDPR compliance, extensive work is underway to identify organisations who are either hosting, accessing or processing HSE personal data within the UK. This is to ensure completion of the EU standard contractual clause agreements, which allow for the continued legal transfer of HSE personal data post-Brexit. HSE's ICT teams have been put in place with all of our main UK suppliers. The HSE continues to notify all suppliers and service providers of their GDP compliance requirements and expectations in the event of a no-deal Brexit, and appropriate steps are also being taken to address clinical trials compliance issues in cooperation with the HPRA. We have put in place a detailed communications plan within the HSE, and we are working closely with the DOH's communication team to ensure relevant stakeholders are updated. We have held a number of stakeholder engagements within the organisation, and we are keeping our website updated on a regular basis. We are engaging with our staff and have a dedicated email in place for any queries or questions that staff may have. Finally, and in summary, the HSE preparations underway are focused on ensuring continuity of all Ireland patient services, environmental health services at ports, workforce issues relating to the free movement of health personnel, maintaining the supply of essential goods and services, and ensuring the HSE continues to be GDPR compliant. Notwithstanding these efforts, the risk of a no-deal Brexit on 31st of October still has the potential to cause some disruption to health services despite the mitigation measures already in train. Working closely with colleagues within the Department, the HPRA and the wider industry, we are very focused on continuing to find positive and practical solutions for our patients, stakeholders and staff in this regard. This concludes my opening statement, and together with my colleagues we will endeavour to answer any questions that committee members may have.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan, for that opening statement. I'm going to temporarily vacate the chair, and Deputy Louise O'Reilly is going to step in for me, and Dr. Nolan is going to make her opening statement. That completes the opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman and members of the committee, and I'd like to thank the committee for giving us this opportunity today to come and speak to you about our Brexit preparations. My name is Lorraine Nolan, Chief Executive of the Health Products Regulatory Authority, and I'm joined by my colleagues Rita Purcell, our Deputy Chief Executive, and Larry O'Dwyer, our Scientific Affairs Manager. The HPRA, as the regulator of medicines and medical devices, has been engaged in preparing for the UK's exit from the EU since Article 50 was invoked. Since the beginning of this year, our preparations and engagement with stakeholders have intensified and have been based on the worst-case scenario associated with a disorderly Brexit. At a high level, there are 3 major strands to our current work. We have been working with companies since Brexit was announced to ensure they understand their obligations to be in regulatory compliance by the 31st of October. We have also been working intensively and proactively with the Department of Health and the HSE on the supply of medicines deemed critical to patient care, and we have been assisting the HSE in its review of the supply of medical devices. This has been supported through our work with primary wholesalers who introduce stock to the market to review their capacity to hold stock levels in the event of a disorderly Brexit. I will speak more about these shortly. Within the HPRA, we have detailed plans to not only address the immediacy of a hard Brexit, but also to continue the HPRA's participation as a key European regulatory agency in the aftermath of Brexit. The final area of focus has been supporting the Department of Health in engaging with the many relevant stakeholders to ensure a common understanding of the issues and a coordinated approach to interaction and communication. In all our work to date, our aim is to ensure to the fullest extent possible that the necessary preparations are completed in time so as to mitigate any potential adverse impacts on patient care. I will now provide an update on specific elements of our preparations for a no-deal scenario. The committee will be aware from your meeting of the 30th of January last that the HPRA has been engaged in an extensive industry engagement exercise with the Department of Health and the HSE focused on the supply of critical medicines. These are medicines with a short shelf life, refrigerated supply chains, time-critical logistics, or compounded for specific patients or patient groups. However, through working with the HSE, this exercise has also been able to review supply arrangements for all prescription medicines, regardless of criticality. The review also involves liaising directly with hospitals, companies and distributors to identify supply routes and ensure companies have contingency plans in place if their supply routes have been from or through the UK. This exercise was first conducted in Q1 of this year, and work has remained ongoing since that time. In advance of the 31st of October deadline, we are again repeating this coordinated outreach to companies to seek final reassurances of their supply arrangements and contingencies for the 31st of October in the event of a disorderly Brexit. This work is continuing as this time. As an example of this work for the committee, I can point to radiopharmaceuticals, which have a short shelf life and very specialised transport and storage requirements. Some do not transit the UK. However, the majority are flown from continental Europe to Ireland via East Midlands Airport by one logistics company. Companies who use this route have previously received assurances from their logistic provider that it will continue to operate these supply routes post-Brexit as it does currently. However, we have been in contact with the companies who supply these products to the Irish market and have confirmed their intention and supplies to continue to supply post-Brexit. We have also requested written assurance from the logistic provider involved. Separately, there is ongoing direct engagement with the provider to ensure that their service can be relied upon and, if necessary, consider alternative solutions that may be required. Currently, all the responses we have received indicate that all parties believe they can continue to supply the Irish market, and all parties are actively considering contingency plans. However, this is a good example of the complexity and the many players that are involved in getting product to Ireland. In this case, as the product is intended for both Ireland and the UK, it must first stop at East Midlands Airport, which would introduce an element outside the control of all the parties. While there is no indication this will cause a problem, it is indicative generally that with multiple independent players in the supply chain, one cannot fully rule out all risks, but the HPRA and the HSE plan to actively monitor this situation and manage as necessary. Another example for the committee also relates to insulins, which are critical medicines for diabetic patients and which need to be refrigerated during transportation and storage. We have engaged with the three suppliers of insulins to Ireland, who have all provided reassurances that they have a minimum of 8 to 10 weeks stock of all insulins in Irish wholesalers on the 31st of October. In addition, all suppliers have taken steps to ensure they are in a position to replenish these stocks post-Brexit, including the use of alternative transport routes which do not involve supply from or via the UK. A key part of our Brexit planning is to ensure that there is sufficient stock in Ireland so that temporary delays during transportation will not significantly impact access by patients to medicines. We have contacted all the primary wholesalers who have provided assurances that for the vast majority of medicines, they hold between 8 to 10 weeks of stock. This level of stock holding will allow Ireland to manage short-term disruptions to the supply of medicines We have also, as part of our engagement with companies supplying the market, requested them to confirm that they will have sufficient stock levels at the 31st of October and can maintain these levels post-Brexit period by appropriate replenishment procedures. We have also continuously stressed to companies the need to be aware of and comply with customs procedures and requirements, and have issued individual letters, follow-up calls and a checklist to that effect. For medicines where stock levels are less than this, we are actively working with the wholesale sector on addressing potential Brexit impacts and ensuring that cases where continuity of patient care could be compromised are, insofar as possible, addressed. This includes the ability, if possible, to build additional stock levels and the development of contingency arrangements to ensure a sustained process of stock replenishment. The work remains ongoing. In relation to the supply of medicines post-Brexit, it needs to be recognised that some products will either come from the UK by air or sea, or by necessity be transported across the UK. The reassurances received from companies are based upon the continued operation of these transport routes, combined with the maintenance of sufficient stock levels in Ireland. However, significant and prolonged delays anywhere along these routes could potentially interrupt supply to the Irish market. While our preparations are focused on ensuring that such impacts are prevented or minimised, there are no absolute guarantees. No major supply cairns for continuity of patient care have been identified to date, and we have, through our shortages protocol, plans in place to address issues should they arise. This framework predates Brexit, as medicine shortages can occur for various reasons on an ongoing basis. I would like to emphasise again that there is no need for hospitals, healthcare professionals or patients to order extra quantities of medicines ahead of Brexit. To do so could disrupt existing stock levels and hamper the supply of medicines for other patients. Market authorisations for medicines place a number of regulatory obligations on the holder. These include that the holder must be based in the EU, and each batch of product imported from a non-EU country must be retested and released in an EU member state. Regulatory compliance among companies has been improving steadily as affected operations have moved from the UK to an EU 27 country. In a repeat of the exercise conducted in Q1 of this year, we issued a list of questions in August to those companies which potentially might not be in regulatory compliance as of the 31st of October or the 31st of December if they availed of a Commission-approved temporary waiver of retesting requirements on importation into the EU. A medicine which is not compliant as of the 31st of October does not automatically present an immediate risk, and we will work to ensure that regulatory issues associated with Brexit will not hinder the supply of medicines in the immediate aftermath. We are continuing to engage with companies to ensure that they address outstanding regulatory actions in a timely manner. Medical devices, unlike medicines, are not authorised by the HPRA. Each medical device on the market requires a CE mark to demonstrate conformity with the regulatory framework. For medium to high-risk devices, a CE certificate issued by a notified body located in any EU member state is required. The HSE, as the main procurer of medical devices for the Irish health system, has engaged in an in-depth exercise of analysing medical devices for exposure to the UK, land bridge or manufacturing, and for certification from a UK notified body. The HPRA is participating in the HSE-led Criticality Assessment Group for Medical Devices and is sharing information with the HSE to assist them in their risk assessment of critical medical devices supplied to and used in the health services. The HPRA has communicated with manufacturers and authorised representatives at national level a number of times to ensure appropriate awareness of the implications of a disorderly Brexit for medical devices. We have also led on EU work with other competent authorities to promote awareness and to prevent adverse impacts on medical devices used in Ireland. From our engagement, we know that larger manufacturers have measures in place to transition their UK medical device certificates to an EU 27 notified body. Many small and medium-sized manufacturers have indicated that their main challenge is in securing an EU 27 notified body to issue new certificates. As such, it remains the case that a significant number of EU certificates have not transitioned to an EU member state. There are a number of factors contributing to this. Historically, there has been a high dependency on UK notified bodies for medical device certification activities. This is due to the broad-ranging designation scope which the UK notified bodies have to conduct such activities and to their size. Notified bodies throughout Europe are also preparing for new EU regulations which apply from May 2020, a factor which is impacting on their ability to take on additional certification activities. The HSE is reviewing the impact of this on medical devices on the Irish market. This situation is not unique to Ireland, though our market is likely to be more impacted. The HPRA and other EU authorities are working together to develop and agree with the European Commission a European approach to manage UK certificates that have not transitioned by the deadline. If such an approach is not agreed, the HPRA has developed contingencies to manage this. Given that a medical device which becomes non-compliant with regulatory requirements after the 31st of October does not present immediate risk, we will work to ensure continuity of care for patients whilst ensuring that products return to compliance as quickly as possible. As government public communications have recognised, any Brexit outcome does not mean that regulatory alignment will mean, any Brexit outcome does not include regulatory alignment will mean change as the UK and Irish markets adjust over time. Brexit will bring change across all areas and in the dynamics of the supply chain and model in Ireland for both medicines and medical devices. The issues we see in the longer term may be quite different to those in the immediate aftermath. It is realistic to expect that companies may, after a period of time, make commercial decisions with respect to the continued viability of supply of certain products to our market. We have stressed to companies that in advance of making any such decisions, they should let us know of their plans as soon as possible. The earlier we have this information, the better we can plan for change, including working with HSE colleagues. Alternatively, we may be able to help in identifying a course of action to prevent such outcome. In closing, Chairman, I would like to reassure the Committee of the strenuous efforts being made by the HPRA staff in relation to protecting the supply of medicines and health products to Irish patients post-Brexit. I also wish to acknowledge the huge collective efforts of our colleagues in the Department of Health and the HSE and the substantial engagement by industry and healthcare professionals. It is this open and cooperative approach among stakeholders across the health product sector that will help to ensure we effectively and collectively manage the potential impact of Brexit on supply and availability. Thank you, Chairman, and we'll be happy to address any questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Ms. Dolan. Thanks to everyone for their contributions. And apologies for missing the first few minutes here. Before I open to the members of the committee, I have a number of questions of my own, and I might come back on some of them as well, if that's okay. Ms. Nolan, just to yourself first. On page 2 of your submission, you say, we have contacted all of the primary wholesalers who have provided assurances that for the vast majority of medicines they will hold between 8 to 10 weeks of stock, and it is this 8 to 10 week stock level that will allow Ireland to manage short-term disruptions. So the vast majority, but not all. Is there an issue with some? Are there some for which we don't have that necessary buffer? And do you believe that we're going to have that issue resolved in advance of a potential no-deal Brexit?
Thank you. I might come in there. Well, we have contacted 44 wholesalers, but what I can say is that nearly 90% of all stock is held by our 2 primary wholesalers, and they are confident. And when they say the vast majority, they are saying that, but for a few product lines. But they're giving us details of those product lines, and we're working through those. So we're able to see whether there's alternatives, whether we need to take contingency action. But it is a picture that changes day by day because they literally have a huge throughput of stock. So what we're also doing is predicting forward as to what the expected picture is on the 31st of October. So right now what we can say is that we are working through any products that have been identified, but they have not identified a significant product for supply, a significant issue of supply to the Irish market. And they believe, I would use the word, substantially all products that are used will have that level of stock. But should there be an issue with the product, our shortages framework will work through it. Larry, do you want to add anything to that?
Just to add to that, unfortunately at any one time we do experience shortages of a number of medicines that are irrespective of Brexit. They're not related to Brexit, and unfortunately whenever Brexit happens there will be ongoing shortages of medicines irrespective of Brexit. So some of the products that are mentioned there are products that are already in short supply for global reasons, in a number of cases manufacturing issues, logistics issues, etc. So just to emphasise that some of those medicines would fall into that category.
Okay, thank you. And just with regard to stockpiling, have you any evidence or any information that that is happening? And I know you're saying your advice is to people not to do it, but I suppose people very rarely do exactly what it is that they're advised to do. And just anecdotally, my understanding is that that is happening, albeit on a very small basis. But I'm just wondering, do you have information about that? Have you encountered that at all?
I would have to say, from the information we have and the intelligence we have, we don't have anything to substantiate that that is the case. And consistently, through all our messaging on Brexit preparation, we've engaged with healthcare professionals, and we really have cultivated their support in pushing that message out, particularly to patients, to ensure that they don't stockpile. As I mentioned in my statement, it's really important. The marketplace operates on a very precise dynamic, and stockpiling that may occur will upset that balance. Yeah. So in terms of ensuring continuity of supply, it's really important that that messaging is out there, that there isn't any stockpiling.
But I suppose from the perspective of people who are, when we take Donegal for an example, they're going to be nearly the worst impacted by it, on the basis that they, that a pharmacist in Donegal might well believe that they're going to be the last people at the end of that supply chain. So I suppose that the advice to them is not to upset the equilibrium, and to ensure that they don't stockpile. But I can foresee an issue with that. Just human nature being what it is. I just have a question in relation to the European health insurance cards. So a commitment was given by government that the EHIC cards would be made available to people in the north. Can you give us an update on that?
I can update on that, Deputy. We had an approval last week at government on the approach to that bill, and we will be going back very shortly. We've a priority team on it, and drafting underway with the Office of Parliamentary Counsel. We will be going back, I would think, before the end of the month to government with a full bill. At that point we will be working with the whips to schedule time in the Oireachtas, and we will obviously make ourselves available as officials to the committee members to talk them through the approach there. So it is a priority that we have that into the Oireachtas in October.
Okay, and then just one final question, and I have a couple more questions, but I'll hold them over. Is there a supply line from mainland Europe straight into Irish ports bypassing Britain? Has that been looked at? Has that been sourced? Are we ready to go with that? Can you give us an update?
Yes, and there's significant supply routes directly from the continent into Ireland, into Dublin Port, shipping companies coming into Dublin Port and shipping coming into Rosslare. So they're well-established routes. There is capacity on those routes, and one of the things that Lorraine Nolan referred to was the modification of supply chains that's already taken place by pharmaceutical companies. So some of them will, depending on the nature of the product, find it just as realistic to come directly into Ireland, and will have actually modified their supply chain and be doing that now. Others will be keeping it under review. There are particular products that aren't relevant to that, particularly products that are sourced from the UK and originate in the UK. But there's substantial shipping capacity to come direct from the continent. It adds about 20 hours to the journey, so it is an issue in terms of the product. So if you hear the discussion that's going on a wider basis, there are certain perishable products, I'm not talking about medicines or medical devices, where that's a challenge, those 20 hours. And in general, once you add 20 hours, you're adding cost, because you need a driver for longer. But for pharmaceuticals and medical devices, often of which are reasonably high-value products, that route exists, and companies have already made the change or will consider the change in the event of Brexit fallout.
Okay, well, we'll consider the change given the time frame, I think, is, And have you been engaging with your counterparts in the north in terms of the maintenance of that supply, on the basis that there is a logic to, as a small island, that we would do our best to withstand Brexit as a unit somewhat.
Yes, I think it's also the fact that much of the trade that ends up in Northern Ireland comes through Dublin Port, so we are conscious of that, and we would be working collaboratively, as we would work with authorities throughout the UK, including on east-west trade. But we were working collaboratively to ensure that there's smooth flow at all stages of that supply chain.
And you've had an ongoing engagement in that regard, so that would include meetings, phone calls, a plan worked up together?
So we have an overall engagement with the Department in Northern Ireland, very intensive engagement across all elements of Brexit. Mr O'Connor has led that interaction, and we have, I won't say quite daily, but we certainly have weekly engagement with our counterparts, as indeed we do with Whitehall, the department in London. The one thing I would say about all of that engagement, everybody's focused on health, which is the important thing, and everybody's seeking to ensure just exactly what we're trying to achieve here, which is no disruption.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Donnelly.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you all very much for your time and for all of your work. I was just very taken by hearing that there's 2 companies bring in 90% of the drugs. What are those 2 companies?
They're the 2 wholesalers, I think. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, 2 wholesalers. So United Drug and Unifar are our biggest wholesalers. That doesn't mean they import all of those drugs. The drugs, they're part of the supply chain for those drugs, and those drugs could be delivered to their warehouses. But manufacturers may be delivering them to their warehouses. So it's not that there's 2 companies to do all the logistics, but they do the wholesaling out, particularly out to the community pharmacy, through those companies.
Okay, and your department are in communication with these 2 companies?
We're in both. All of the agencies represented here are in very close communication with them. And probably worth saying that on the 10th of September last, we had every stakeholder. We had the wholesalers, we had the Irish Pharmaceutical Union, we had IFA as the major manufacturers, we had Medicines for Ireland as the generic manufacturers, all around the same table, the Minister present, where we got updates on everybody's preparations, and we gave updates on ours. And we are all on the same page on this. We're all working together on it, and our assessment is shared right across those.
Okay, thank you. And the Minister has met both companies?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Sorry, at that meeting, I think there was one. I'm not certain the 2 were there, but there was. What we did was we looked for representatives from the Wholesaler Association, and that representative was from one of the companies. But just maybe Lorraine or the HSE can talk about their actual daily outreach into those companies.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Can I just check that the Minister presumably has met with both of these companies, has he?
The bit I wanted to correct was the September 10th meeting. On the attendance at that meeting, maybe Eamon can tell me if the 2 companies were there. I know there was United Drug were there.
Yeah, so the United Drug and Unifar form part of the Pharmaceutical Distributors Federation, and representatives from both companies were represented the PDF at that meeting. The Minister attended, and a previous meeting again back earlier in the year. I think it was back in April, May time as well.
Okay, thank you. There's a lot of public concern, obviously, about the impact on drugs and devices. And the messages are mixed. Just in preparation for this morning, I just did a quick look back myself. On the 20th of August, the British Medical Journal reported that a no-deal Brexit may worsen drug shortages. On the 6th of September, the Irish Times reported Varadkar rules out food medicine shortages under no-deal Brexit. Unfortunately for us, on the 19th of September, the British Brexit Secretary, Steve Barclay, he pointed out that 2/3 of our drugs actually come across the UK by land. And he said there could be shortages in Ireland. And the next day, the government dismissed those warnings. So the British Medical Journal is warning, and the Brexit Secretary is warning. In Ireland, those warnings are being dismissed as they relate to us. But then we have the statements this morning, and indeed reported on RTE last night, that actually there are risks, and specifically what was picked up was the risk to devices. So it feels to the casual observer, or indeed to the people who are relying on these drugs and devices, that they're hearing very conflicting things, and they're hearing them from some very, very senior sources. Can I ask, is it the case that 2/3 of the drugs do come across the land bridge, the UK land bridge, because there is a very serious risk to multiple days of disruption to that land bridge, and we've no idea how long those delays could go on for. Is it the case that 2/3 of the drugs do in fact come across the land bridge? Given that, what are the highest risks in terms of the drugs? I accept you're all trying to do everything you can to mitigate the risks, but your language, understandably, is hedging, which I think it has to. It's not a criticism. Mr. Breslin, you talk about Ireland is unlikely to face medicine shortages in the period immediately after, but it may face, and the language is couched. So could I ask, are 2/3 coming across the land bridge? What are the risks? Which drugs are at risk, do you think, for which types of patients? And then specifically, we're hearing this morning, I think, some quite stark warnings on medical devices. Could you talk to us a bit about which medical devices are we talking about? Are we talking about pacemakers? Are we talking about life-saving medical devices? Are we talking about more day-to-day devices like disposable syringes? What kind of devices are we talking about? And both for the drugs that are high risk and the devices that are high risk, what type of risks or impact are you foreseeing and hoping to mitigate against for patients?
I'll come back to the device in a moment, because actually the devices primarily is not a supply issue, it's a regulatory issue, so it's quite distinct. Of course, we are listening to what UK sources are saying, but it's clear to me the UK sources aren't working from the same information base as we are. The 60% figure has originated from Ireland. It's the figure that we looked at 2 years ago when we started our Brexit planning, as not just what's coming through the land bridge, but also including what's originating from the UK. So it's product with UK touch points. And when we set about making our preparations 2 years ago, that they are the products that we sought to protect. We have done, as you've heard there, a very, very significant amount of work and exercises to guard and protect those products. So that's a figure that we originated. It's not a figure that the British have come up with, and it's the universe of products that we have been working on with the industry for 2 years now to protect them in the event of a no-deal Brexit. Importantly, the engagement has been at 2 levels with industry on this. So the engagement has been with suppliers, where we've looked both as regulator and the HSE as customer to get reassurances that those companies have undertaken the Brexit preparations that they need to. And I've talked about some of the options that they face in that situation, including coming direct to Ireland. All of them have, both to the regulator and the HSE, reassured them on their Brexit preparedness. And we have had that in the room when we've brought everybody together in a full discussion of this, that people are confident in their preparations. But the second thing we did at the start of this year was to go at this from another direction. So rather than going from top down with companies, we put in place a criticality assessment exercise where we actually looked at particular...
I'm sorry to cut across you. It's just,
yes.
I think we're veering back into the statements. The question I'm asking, Mr. Breslin, is which drugs and which devices are at risk?
That's the process by which we determine the vulnerability and the impact. So the criticality assessment exercise has looked at the therapeutic areas where there would be high impact if we didn't have the drug, and it's looked at the vulnerability of the drug, including its relationship to the UK, and has then interrogated with the manufacturers those products to verify, not simply to take an assurance, but to verify the extent of the preparations that are in place. And resulting from that, we have very much whittled down the type of risks that we face. And without being categoric on it, our biggest risk in the initial period is short shelf life drugs. If we have disruption of a drug where we have 8 to 10 weeks of supply already buffered in Ireland, we can replenish over that period as we go along. But if we have a short shelf life drug and there is disruption in the UK, then that is of concern to us. Actually, most of those very, very short shelf life drugs are not coming through the land bridge, but some of them are coming direct from the UK to Ireland. So they're manufactured in the UK and they're coming across the Irish Sea. And we have worked with the suppliers on those particular drugs, assessing the capacity that we have within the country in the first instance. So if we had no ability to...
I'm sorry to cut across it. You're answering a very broad question that I'm not really asking, which is what are all the safety concerns. What I'm asking you specifically is which drugs and which devices. And if you'd prefer not to say because of public fear, that's fine, and we can move on. But you're answering a much broader question I'm not really asking you. Are you in a position to identify drugs and devices? And if you're not, that's okay. We'll move on.
So we don't, as we've said in our statements, including in the HPRA statement, we don't have products that at this point we have that concern about. Okay. But we are not closing the book on this. Yeah. We are staying with those potentially impactful products to make sure that everything we have been told and verified stays the same throughout the period. And that's why we need to be ready for any eventuality.
Okay, thank you. So there are, just to be clear, the answer to the question is no. There are not specific drugs and devices that you have identified.
There are no specific drugs and devices currently that we see as an immediate Brexit problem for us. And
that's fine.
We will build contingencies and have built contingencies about areas of risk.
Okay, thank you. So no is the,
yes.
is the answer. Thank you. Food. And there was a lot of talk about food regulation. If the Prime Minister and the President of the US do this wonderful trade deal where the President astonishingly said he was going to quadruple trade with the UK, let's say American beef starts landing in Belfast. In terms of protecting Irish beef, imposing EU standards on that beef, on the broad assumption that the beef coming from the US will almost certainly not meet EU standards in a variety of different ways. What happens? Does the Irish state have to take action to stop that beef crossing the border from the 6 counties?
So two things. One is, day one, there's not regulatory divergence. So we have time periods here within which to put in place strategies. But on day one, we do have inspections in the ports for east-west trade. The UK will be a third country, and we will have an inspection process with environmental health inspectors in the ports to spot check food products that are coming in. Department of Agriculture will have the same in respect of meats. So that will be in place, irregardless of the fact that actually on day one, the UK's own regulatory standards will be equivalent.
So just so that I understand then, so beef coming into Belfast, am I right in thinking that you're saying that there will be Irish state officials in Northern Irish ports?
No, the ports I'm talking about are Dublin Port and Rosslare, which are the third country.
The question I'm asking is about the Northern Irish ports.
And the answer to that is the overall answer that the government has given, which is that there is intensive engagement with the European Commission around north-south flows, and that issue is being worked through in a situation where everybody is agreed that we need to manage that, balancing the single market requirements with the need to protect the north-south cooperation and agreements that are in place.
And I appreciate that, and I'm not asking you to make policy calls, obviously that's for the Minister, but we're 26 working days away from a de facto no-deal Brexit. And so there will be foodstuffs coming into Northern Ireland that fall outside any recognised regulatory regime. Will we have any officials, and we are all agreed we're not going to stop anything at the border, so the only place it can really be checked is when it lands in Northern Ireland. So for foodstuffs, which will no longer be under any safety or regulatory regimes we recognise, and for drugs that will similarly not be under those regimes, landing in Northern Ireland, be it the airport or the ports, will the Irish state have any officials, is there a plan, because we're 26 working days away, to have any Irish officials there on the basis that once they leave the ports, certainly nobody will be checking anything in the short term because there will be no checks at the border?
So the first thing is the standards. There's a presumption in what you say that the standards will be different in the north.
No, not that they'll be different, but they will be framework that is no longer recognised.
But they would still have their own food safety and medicine standards,
Yeah, sure.
and they will be implementing them in order to protect their own citizens.
Yeah.
The second question is that we will await the agreement that is reached between Ireland and the European Commission to activate anything in terms of food safety that we need to activate.
Okay.
And we have not done so at this stage.
Okay. Thank you. Can I ask, on the money side, obviously a no-deal Brexit is going to leave Ireland with less cash. Is there a fiscal plan within the HSC for that eventuality? So do you have a plan for next year that says, here's the assumed money we're going to have, but there's a good chance we're going to have whatever it is, $500 million less, $1 billion less. Is there any contingency planning being done for running our healthcare system in the event of having less money than we would like because of a no-deal Brexit?
So the first category of issues are the Brexit-related costs that we are likely to incur, and we are making provision, have made provision this year and will make provision for them, and that's important, including the environmental health staff that will be required at the ports. But the second issue falls within the overall fiscal budgetary strategy that the Minister for Public Expenditure has said, and we are all operating to a no-deal Brexit budget at this stage. So in finalising the budget for next year, it won't be finalised on a let's hope nothing happens basis. It will be finalised on a no-deal Brexit basis, and the Department and the HSC will develop up their plans for next year on that basis. So we don't envisage that they will require to be adjusted in the event of no deal.
Okay, thank you. Final question is on GDPR. So if there is a no-deal Brexit, the UK will not be governed by GDPR. There is quite an active exchange of patient information, be it for the treatment abroad scheme and various other schemes, particularly north-south. Given that the UK would be outside the GDPR regime, and given that we have a statutory responsibility to protect the data of our citizens here, what are the implications of that? So, for example, somebody goes to Northern Ireland for a cataract operation, which is happening regularly enough. Are there any data implications and GDPR implications for that?
Yeah, so there's specific arrangements to be put in place in those situations. I might have Maurice just update you on that.
Yeah, there's a lot of work being done to ensure that GDPR is honoured in respect of continuing arrangements with the UK when it's a third country. So all our regulators have been in contact with UK regulators. All service providers have been in contact with their counterparts, north, south and east, west, to inform them of the obligations that they would have in terms of interfacing with the EU where the GDPR applies. So we've supported in very practical ways our agencies and our service providers to do this. There's standard contractual clauses that need to be put in place to ensure, say, that the information in respect of a patient going to Alton-Galvin is treated with the safety, security, confidentiality that's expected in EU terms. So it's been an awful lot of the work over recent years, and it's been something that I suppose when you compare our preparedness now to preparedness in March, it's something that we're much more comprehensively ready for.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Before I come to Deputy O'Connell, I just want a brief follow-up on that in relation to GDPR. You're saying that you've been in touch, that the stakeholders are all engaging with the relevant, their counterparts in Britain in relation to sharing information. So is your expectation that those people will have local level agreements, that they'll have an agreement between themselves on how that data is managed? So, for example, an organisation that might be a 32 county, I'm not about to make a big political statement, am I? An organisation that might be a 32 county organisation, they may hold information, I mean, like if their headquarters, say, is in Dublin, right, they might hold information on people north and south. So are you relying on them to come up with an agreement? So they clearly will have an organisation in Britain, they have an organisation here in the 26th and in the 6th. Are you relying on them to come up with a local agreement? Are you giving them direction?
Yeah.
How's in terms of how the data is going to be managed? Because on the 1st of November, potentially, some of that information that they have is governed by GDPR. Some of it is governed by mean, we don't have a name for it yet, whatever that rule might be. So are they going to be expected as an organisation to devise those rules? Are you giving them guidance? Have you given them an instruction? What way is that working?
Yeah, it's a matter for each agency and each service provider to ensure its compliance with EU regulations. So it is their responsibility in the first instance, but we have been very proactive in supporting agencies and service providers in understanding how to secure the agreements. A little bit like other issues, the UK has total equivalence and the exact same standards right now and for the immediate future. But there's a very big programme of work to ensure that local to local. There's also, in terms of maintaining, say, treatment abroad and cross-border directive services equivalent to those, there's a lot of data exchange then to ensure the reciprocation and the reimbursements, and provision is being made to develop at national level GDPR agreements. So
just in the instance you're talking about.
To clarify, I'm talking about information that's held on British citizens here in Dublin, which will no longer be covered by GDPR, but will somehow. I'm just wondering how will that.
So the reverse is actually the problem. The transmission of EU data, and we'll be EU and they won't, outside of the EU, needs to be governed by agreement and convention between the person who's transmitting it and the person who's receiving it. And there are model agreements to do that. It might be helpful for the HSE to talk to the fact that they've put them in place across.
Yeah, no, that's specifically what my question is about. Is that going to be at the level of the organisation? Are you just issuing a template?
There are contracts that are put in place with all the ICT suppliers, and we're insisting this is mandatory. It's not a request. They're given the new documentation for them to sign up and they need to do that. So that is put in place to protect the information both ways. So that's in place.
That's in place
and
already.
all of our suppliers have been requested to do that, and any communications that will occur after Brexit.
Paula might just talk to the service arrangements that we have.
Deputy O'Reilly. Yes, the European Commission have given us direction in the form of a model agreement. So we've used that model agreement. 2 years ago, we started a mapping exercise of all of the services that operate on a north, south, east, west, all island basis. So we have that list. So we've worked our way down through with the services. We have a DPO, a data protection officer in the HSC, and he has a deputy, so he has a structure, deputy DPOs. But with the services on the Brexit team, we have actually drafted those SCCs, the standard contractual clause, the 10-page that we got from the European Commission that you can't alter because of the clauses that are on it. And we have mapped out what data they are going to share based on the list of service level agreements and memorandums of understanding that are in place. And we're well down the road of them, and they will be all complete. There is absolutely no resistance with our northern colleagues, and they will be all being signed just as a matter of process as we're working through them.
Thank you. Deputy O'Connell.
Mr O'Connor, you said that we're much better prepared now than we were in March. Good thing we had an extension, so we'd be kind of goosed. In terms of Deputy Donnelly was trying to get to what products in particular might be potentially in short supply. So I'm assuming that from your opening statements we can take that everything will stay the same. The status quo will remain the same, and we have 10 to 12 weeks headroom in terms of supplies. But for perishable short life products, so insulin is not one of those. It's a long shelf life or fridge life product, and I think from memory 6 months out of the fridge it can be still used, most of them anyway. So I'm assuming you're talking about bespoke bags of feeds and chemotherapy. So I just think maybe perhaps that's where Deputy Donnelly was going. Like these are a very vulnerable patient cohort. So just for the benefit of the committee, I'd imagine it's feeds coming in for prem babies in the Coombe, and bespoke chemo bags that are made. I know there's somewhere on the west coast of the UK that we're getting a lot of our stuff from. So perhaps you could just expand on those.
Yeah, we'll expand on those, and the points I'm making that they're not exclusive to one supply route. So Eamon might just talk to the areas that we've put in place plans around.
Certainly. So in the first instance we were talking about risk, but just because there's a risk doesn't necessarily mean there's a serious instance of a case for disruption to supply. We're recognising the risk, and then we're engaging in direct and specific engagement with the suppliers of those products. So you've correctly identified we're talking about what we call total parental nutrition, the feeds for baby bags or for adults as well, compounded products, oncology products as well.
And just going to hold you there for a second. A newborn baby that requires, or a prem baby that requires a bespoke bag of feed, I know from experience that that bag of feed for the baby goes missing, they have to be maintained on just basic fluids. So essentially it's a maintenance, keep them alive rather than, you know, fix them process. I mean, I think just for people with sick children, and I'm not trying to create panic, but this is very serious in terms of that component of the feeding or the medicine supply chain.
Absolutely, I wouldn't disagree with you. That's why they were in our Category 1 or our Group 1 priority in terms of our criticality assessment exercise. They were top of the pyramid, as we're calling it, and we're engaging directly with those companies, identifying the suppliers to the Irish market and to our hospitals. That was involved going out to all the hospitals involved in that clinical space and understanding where they're sourcing from, then going back to those suppliers and engaging with them to understand on a number of levels, are they committed to continue to supply the Irish market in the first instance, which is an important factor. Given the fact that the UK is also an island as well, the fact that they will have the raw materials and consumables to continue to produce those products, and the ability to keep sending those products into the Irish market. The assurances we've received up until April on the first phase were very positive. We've repeated that exercise again, and the responses we're getting are extremely positive and a very high level of assurances in that regard in terms of their commitment to continue to supply the Irish market and indeed their ability to supply the Irish market in that respect. There obviously is a risk in terms of moving those products from point A to point B. Those companies have been asked to consider and are putting in place contingency measures as well. Secretary General,
that bag of feed gets delayed, it's gone.
The shelf life on those products isn't that narrow. We've engaged with clinicians in that space, and we refer to colleagues in HPR who can maybe speak to that. But the shelf life on those products isn't that narrow.
Okay, maybe the expert could speak, Lorraine.
Sorry,
I'm just. What is the shelf life on them?
The witnesses are doing the best to answer the questions, and I think Ms. Nolan wants to come in.
I mean, I would concur with absolutely everything Eamon has said. I'm really just adding a little bit to that. I think we need to clarify then the pace of paediatric TPN that's actually manufactured by a manufacturer based in Ireland. So the contract is actually with the manufacturer that's based in Ireland. So I think Eamon is absolutely right. I mean, these are very high-risk products. These are very vulnerable patient groups. So in absolutely everything we have been doing here in this, they have gotten the highest priority and attention. So there's complexity. We have multiple supply, but in terms of routes of supply, but in terms of paediatric TPN, it's actually contracted to a manufacturer based in Ireland.
So is it the adult TPN or what's coming from the West Coast?
Larry, would you maybe pick up that point because you've been more closely involved in this?
So we are sourcing some adult hospital TPN from the UK. Deputy Colin, you might be aware that we recently actually experienced a shortage of that linked to manufacturing issues at that facility. And our medicine shortages framework kicked in at that stage, and we worked with the clinicians on the ground through the hospital network and the company involved to minimise and avoid any clinical impact on the patients. And that was done by using authorised parental nutrition products that are available through the normal channels where possible, and I suppose preferentially using the available compounding capacity for the patients who had a bespoke clinical need.
And has there been any, whoever knows the answer, has there been any scope or move towards Irish production, substituting, so that have we any facilities in Ireland that are going to take on some of the work that we're contracting out to the UK already, or we're getting from the UK, of these perishable products?
So that is part of our contingency planning, and that's why we can talk to no immediate issues. So both in that case and also, just because you did raise cancer compounding, 15% of our volumes come from the UK, so we originate 85% here, and we will seek to boost that. We have facilities here, including in public hospitals, where through overtime and other strategies we can seek to boost that. We will also seek to husband that product as well to make sure that we manage it as efficiently as possible over the period. And all of that builds upon what Eamon has said, the interrogation of suppliers who are coming across the Irish Sea on the resilience of their supply chain and their contingency planning around that. So if a problem were to arise in a particular part of the supply chain, what would their plan be around that? So there are contingency plans. They don't just operate on the basis that we hope everything will go well. We scenario plan them such that if 3 or 4 things were to go against us, we would have a further backup plan in that situation.
Okay. So if, just say if there's a hard Brexit and there's no agreement reached at all in 20 whatever days time, are all bets off? Can we still? We've agreed that the status quo can with these products can come in, but if there's any major upset, are we expecting a tariff on the 15% of products coming in? Are we expecting anything like that? Anything that could hold us to ransom is really what I'm saying. For the portion that we can't make ourselves, or we haven't got an equivalent ready-made, what can be done? Can we be held to ransom as a state in terms of getting a few percentage of product in from the UK by charging us exorbitant amounts or whatever?
No. The tariff issue doesn't arise, and in terms of other issues, we have contractual relationships, and we are a customer in that situation. I think it's more the question of where the problem arises, which will not be of anybody's intentional making, but so, for example, a lot of discussion has happened around the Dover Straits and the fact that product may not be able to get through the Dover Straits, certainly in the timelines that are currently happening. The products we're talking about here, which are coming from England, are not subject to the Dover Straits. They'll be subject to the Irish Sea. So at the moment they may be coming from Holyhead, they may be coming from Liverpool. There will be other ports available to Pembroke and Fishguard and so on. So there's more than one route into Ireland, and products will that originate in the UK won't have to come through the Dover Straits. The issue around the Dover Straits is that if that were to persist for a significant period, then supply through that will become an issue. And people will, as the Chair asked the question, people will in that situation look to divert and not come through the Dover Straits and instead come directly into the country. So the short shelf life products, the particular products that we're touching on there, are not ones that are subject to that risk. But there is a risk related to the Dover Straits, but it falls in relation to other categories of products. And then lastly, just to be comprehensive, Lorraine in her opening statement talked about radiopharmaceuticals, and that's a particular, again, it's a Category 1 product in our critical assessment exercise, and we have fully investigated the supply chain there, which is by air freight, and flies into East Midlands Airport. The UK stock of radiopharmaceuticals is taken off at that point. The Irish stock transits over to Ireland, again by air freight. And so the detailed discussion with the logistics and with the supply companies around the continued resilience of that route is really important, but it's not a Dover Straits issue. That issue doesn't affect that product, but we have to be alive to it, as set out in the opening statement.
So it's the radioisotopes coming over for use in radiology. I don't know much about that area. Is that product coming in? And what happens if we don't sort out the East Midlands situation? Is there
it's not that we don't sort it out, because it's working, and everybody has said it will work, and it will need to work for the UK supply.
Yeah.
So, it is actually difficult to envisage how something would arise or why it would arise in that situation. We have full agreement between Europe and the UK around air transit. So it's not that somebody would intentionally do something, but that's not enough for us to say, OK, job done, move on. Because of the impact of that, we have to have specific contingency arrangements in place around that. We are talking to the suppliers around that. But as much as anything, we are monitoring the situation for any rapid response that we would have to introduce and fallback positions that would have to be put in place. But by far the most resilient and preferable route is the route that's currently being used, and sustaining that is our key strategy.
And what sort of headroom have we there? 10 to 12 weeks of product, or does it come in?
So that's a very short shelf life product. Eamon may talk to it, but it's very short. It's it's a half life. It loses. So
So how long? If things just went pear-shaped there, which we don't expect it to happen, how long do we have
Let's be honest, there's no headroom in relation to radiopharmaceuticals in that respect because they cannot be stored. There are other contingencies that we would explore with the companies, but there are inherent risks associated with those as well. The supply chain for that is necessarily just in time. There's a very specific timeline between getting to the airport on the European continent, flying in and flying out again. That's the current situation as we have right now. It should be noted that the companies involved have contingency measures in place for those issues right now, and those can be employed in a shorter term. And then we would look, and we're looking to engage with, and have engaged with the suppliers, the distributors, and the logistics companies involved in terms of providing higher levels of assurance. We want to get the utmost assurance we can in this space because you quite rightly point out there's a risk there, but a risk does not necessarily translate to there being a problem. It's just what steps we can take to mitigate against those.
Just, another question, in terms of counterfeit medicines, or people being opportunistic when everybody else is concerned about maintaining the integrity of the supply chain, has the criminal element been considered in terms of where there's perhaps breakdowns in regulation and breakdown in the status quo, that there would be opportunistic individuals out there that would release large batches of counterfeit medicines onto the market? Has that element been considered from the integrity of the supply chain? If anyone could speak
to that. HPRA on that one.
I can take that one as well too. I suppose within the European network we work within for regulation of medicines, there is a very extensive kind of protocols and procedure in place in terms of exchange of information in relation to counterfeit. So obviously those European systems will stay going after Brexit as well too. We obviously have a very close working relationship bilaterally with our counterpart agency in the UK, the MHRA. And we have now set up a process moving forward of engagement at very frequent intervals, and sharing of information in kinds of supply chain integrity is part of that protocol that we will include there as well. And just to say that the radiopharmaceuticals is an issue that we've had quite extensive discussion with our colleagues in the UK agency on as well too. We've also agreed to work bilaterally to support each other, and as colleagues from the Department of Health have indicated, these are very short shelf life products. You know, the maximum they possibly have is 24 hours or less. They have a very discrete usage. They're only intended for particular patient groups, so there is no competition between two markets for these. It's just a matter of working to ensure that we can keep the flow moving. So we have full commitment from their side to working with us to ensure that.
So it's in everybody's interest.
It's in absolutely everybody's interest. Yes.
Yeah. And just finally, in the medical devices. So. Would it be true to say, I suppose, the UK has been everyone's piggybacking off their regulation, and now, I suppose, if there's a hard Brexit, we're in a position where we can no longer do that. Is there any, I suppose, it's historic high dependency on the UK. Is there, I suppose, May 2020 things are changing. So we've only really got that 9-month period where something could go wrong. Is there a concern there in terms of new medical devices coming on the market? Is there anything in particular that we think we really need that's going to come on stream in the next few months? So I know this asking me to predict the future, but do you see anything that's coming out that patients may have to do without if there's a fallow period?
I think in answering that question, I'll take the first part in terms of the regulatory processes, and then maybe pass to colleagues from the HSE in terms of their ongoing review and evaluation of medical devices. You are right, yes, there has been historically a high dependency on the UK in terms of its regulatory activities, and specifically certification activities for medical devices in Europe. That being said, I think there's an issue in terms of scale here and in terms of numbers that may be impacted, and I think we are working very hard and in close dialogue with the European Commission on this issue, and we would be hopeful that a European solution can be achieved here to actually kind of have an ordered regulatory transition, is the way that I would describe it. If that's not achieved, I mean, at the end of the day, from the point of view of the safety of these devices and the quality of these devices and their performance, just because their regulatory compliance may fall as the 31st of October, it doesn't necessarily present any immediate risk to patients. And in fact, from a regulatory viewpoint, given that the UK has been totally aligned up to the 31st of October, we have full alliance. We will manage that situation on a national basis in terms of the regulatory compliance, because we will not allow it to compromise continuity of care to patients. So just to give that reassurance from a regulatory process, it can be managed. We obviously will have to work with the industry to ensure that they are working towards that compliance, to making their devices compliant as soon as possible. Yes, the situation is changing on a regulatory basis in Europe. I think that is an excellent thing in terms of protection of public health, because the whole framework that is coming into place is to raise the standards of patient protection. The notified body system in Europe is working through a process, so there is a timing issue with this, which over time, will sort itself out. It's just unfortunate that Brexit and the introduction of the new regulatory changes have kind of coincided, as you like, but I would be confident that a European solution can be found. So perhaps if I can pass now to the colleagues from the HSE to maybe speak about the assessment work on devices that has been taking place.
As I mentioned, Deputy, in my opening remarks, this has been an area of particular focus for us in our preparations. I'll probably hand over to Mr. Swords now, who can talk you through the detail.
Well, as we had said the last time, the work that we were carrying out in relation to the investigation of our supply chain for our medical devices was extensive. We were looking at, and we mentioned risk earlier on, we were looking at areas of risk and what might cause problems as we go forward. And we were looking at what's manufactured in the UK, what's distributed through the land bridge, are there alternatives, and then of course the notifying bodies, which you've heard quite a lot about. The notifying bodies being the critical area that headlighted it up as a red risk. If it fell under that, we were very concerned, and we've been working with the department and the HPRA extensively around mitigating against those risks and seeing as we go. Now, we've been in touch just to size the medical devices. It's enormous. Across worldwide, you're looking at 600,000 categories of products. Now, you can imagine the amount of items that come in under that. In our area, we're looking at 2 million items, roughly, that go across 39 categories across 274 companies. So we're working quite a lot in the extensive on communications. There's been numerous communications with the companies in conjunction with the HPRA and the department. But not only that, we meet them face to face as well. And we're at that stage now where we're at our third iteration of meetings. Not least yesterday we were with 70 companies down in Galway, and we had quite a very, very good engagement around products that we would consider to be at risk because of notifying issues. Now, as we went through those the risks, if you want to call it, we honed down on areas. First of all, we got assurances that the companies were aware that this was coming and Brexit was very serious, and it took a little while for them to actually understand the depth and the work that would have to be gone through. And we pestered them with communications, and we compliment them on staying with us and staying patient with us in relation to all the questions we asked them. The response has been fantastic from industry and from the distributors, and that should be noted. Really, when you look at the effort that's gone through from the department and from HPRA and ourselves and HSE and doing the work that we do every day, but also to map that with the cooperation that we've got from the manufacturers and the distributors, it really lends itself to showing a great unity in finding and making sure that we don't have risks that actually affect patient care.
So they need to keep their product selling. It's in their interest to cooperate.
Of course, of course. And you know, one of the advantages that we have in Ireland is that we rely a lot on distributors, not so much on manufacturing, which is it's different to Europe, and we have transport issues across the seas as has been outlined. But of course, you know, but then that's an advantage in that we've many irons in the fire and we've got more areas of supply. Nonetheless, we all rely on the transportation across, you know, the seas and how that's dealt with. We're seeing a lot of companies and a lot of manufacturers diverting from the UK and going around the land bridge. And, you know, we're getting very strong information on how the supply chain operates. And that's another distinctive advantage of, if you want to call it an advantage, when you have Brexit coming, you learn a lot about the supply chain. What we found is that the supply chain has learned a lot about itself. in that a lot of distributors didn't actually understand where their products came from, but they've had to learn because of the way we probed them and the way we worked with them in that whole area. So as we move forward, we're looking now, we're at the stage where we've satisfied ourselves that the distributors and the manufacturers are looking at this in a very serious way, and that they have found assurance on notifying bodies. But the issue being the notifying body, they're willing to transfer the notifying body from the UK to an EU 27 notifying body, but the capacity within that is taking time because of the pressures that are on it. Now, in that area, I think Deputy Donnelly asked, what are the areas of risk? Whether you want to call it a risk or whether you want to call it contingency planning, you can use the terminology as you wish, but we're forward planning on this. So what we're doing is we're taking all the areas that haven't confirmed that they have transferred the notifying body, and we're looking at those areas, in particular, to saying, do we need additional stocks? And that's where it's a very concentrated effort, rather than saying take stock and stockpile. I think Chair mentioned stockpiling earlier on. Was there evidence of stockpiling? Absolutely not. We took a policy at the early stage with the department not to stockpile, and that was the right thing to do, because stockpiling, as you know, creates its own issues. You have peaks and valleys in manufacturing, you can lose jobs, and then when you go back to it again, you don't have it there. So the best supply chain is a straight line supply chain and continuity of supply, and that's what we've been working on all along. There is evidence of stockpiling in the UK, and that's causing problems and it's causing concerns in some of the areas that we're looking at where the notifying bodies haven't transferred or haven't been confirmed transferred over. So what we're doing at that is we're meeting, there's approximately 30 companies affected by this at the moment across 6,500 line items, and we're meeting with the companies as we speak on an ongoing basis to put the mitigating action in place. We've taken additional storage space in Ballycoolan, 50,000 square foot of storage space, purposely for the event of ring fencing stock that will be required or we deem to be at risk. So we're not saying we're putting it into the hospitals or into the NDC, or we're asking the companies to take extra. This is a contingency on top of the contingency. So just to summarise that, we have 3 weeks stock in the hospitals approximately. Some will have 4 and some will have 2.5. On average it's about 3 weeks. We have 7 weeks in the NDC of stock that we're using across 6,000 lines. And then on top of that, at the HPRA have mentioned, particularly in the distribution of drugs in that area, 8 to 10 weeks, but on average it's about 6 weeks. So what we're looking at is buying a bit of time, if you like, for any issue that may arise because of the notifying bodies, and examining each of those areas. And they're across cardiology. There's one particular company we've taken in an extra 4 months stock to ensure that we don't have an issue on the paediatric cardiology, ophthalmics and areas like that. Surgical packs, which are hugely bulky. We're taking in, but we've been in discussions with our 12 suppliers that we have within that. We've been in detailed discussion with the manufacturers here, and we're actually confident now that we'll be able to allay any issues that may arise in that area. So they're the type of contingencies that we're putting in place. But could I just say, we're at the final stages of going through scenarios, and that we're confident that there's supply in the system. We're confident that the distributors and the manufacturers are working with us, and that, of course, with the department and support of the HPRA, we're confident that we'll overcome any issues that may arise.
I just wanted to clarify for the general audience, really, that what we're talking about there is medical devices, lest there be any confusion around it. And then secondly, just to go back to the point that was made in the opening statement, this is a Europe-wide issue. There are medical devices that are manufactured across Europe that have a CE mark from a UK notified body. So the solution to this won't just be what we've talked about here, but will also be around the table in Brussels saying actually what is the risk, and we will have to make a decision around.
That we're under a little bit of pressure for time. I know Deputy Durkan hasn't come in yet, and I believe Deputy Donnelly has an ancillary question. I have just one very brief question before we go any further. We're talking a lot about stakeholder engagement and about the level of meetings, and indeed we are, by all accounts, according to yourselves, in better shape than we were in March. What's the extent of the involvement of the Minister in these meetings? Is it a case that he chairs them? Does he attend them? Can you give us an idea of whether or not the extent to which the approach is hands-on?
Yeah, so there's different levels of involvement. We have clinical groupings that are meeting on this, where I'm not present, We have the operations group, which I've outlined, which meets on a weekly basis, where there's Deputy Secretary General. I'll meet next Friday with the key agencies as well, and then we sit down and we brief the Minister, and the Minister has met with stakeholders. He's come to the weekly meetings. He doesn't come to every weekly meeting because we are working through a level of detail there. But as a group, we've briefed him. As officials in the department, we've briefed him. And he has also met the wide group of stakeholders that we bring round the table. And we've had a number of those meetings. And he's been able to hear at first hand what we've been telling him.
But he doesn't attend every one of those weekly meetings, but he will get a briefing after.
He gets a regular briefing. And obviously for government, which he attends every Tuesday, we're giving him briefing on all of the Brexit issues. So it's on the agenda. That's
a more than weekly briefing then, you're saying?
Yes. Well, like last Thursday, he would have been briefed on issues at government, and we would have had the Minister and the Management Board sit down with Brexit as a specific agenda item, and we would have gone through that. He's as up to speed as anybody in the department on Brexit issues.
Indeed. Okay, so Deputy Durkan. And I am conscious of time, but I don't in any way want to limit your time.
Thank you very much.
If you do go over, you are going to be eating into Deputy Donnelly's time, so you can start that out yourself.
Which you will bear in mind. I thank our witnesses for this morning and for giving their detailed replies. Can I ask, in relation to sensitive and short-life products, do you have provision made in the event of stockpiling elsewhere, which may impact on you? Do you have sufficient refrigerated space to deal with supply issues in that area in order to ensure continuity of supply for the Irish market?
Yes, no, absolutely. And so one important factor in the Irish distribution chain is that we hold quite an amount of stock on a normal basis within that distribution chain. So when we talk about wholesalers, we talk about pharmacists, we talk about the HSE, they have an existing buffer there, and that for a product that needs to be refrigerated has high level of refrigeration. So this is the norm for us. Other markets which are just in time and they run with much less stock wouldn't be able to have the holding of that we have, because our particular features of our wholesaling and distribution system means that we have that built in, and it'll be one of the things that we will call on if we run into temporary problems over the course of this.
In the event of, for example, I have to ask this question. Presumably you have identified the extent to which you can replicate the supply chains outside of the UK. In all situations, because one may have a knock-on effect to another, and with consequences. So the first thing, if I were in the business of distribution, I would look at where the product was coming from, and if sourced in the UK, which is likely to cause a problem, to what extent have you made arrangements for alternative sourcing in the continent and picked the best one? And the next part of that question is in relation to fluctuations in the money market and the sterling in sourcing supplies in the UK. Presumably, you factored in the value of the pound sterling and the buying power of the euro against it at the present time, and given the fact that's likely to go lower as we go deeper into the uncertainty.
So, yeah, two things. One, look, the context of this industry is really important. For much of this product, we are talking about some of the largest multinational enterprises that exist. Some of them have a manufacturing presence here, but all of them have a multinational reach. Many of them have logistics operations that would far outweigh anything that the department, the HSE or HPRA would have. So our biggest defence in this situation is the sophistication and the expertise of the industry with which we're dealing. And when we engage with them, it's very clear the amount of logistical thought that has gone into this issue. And also the quality systems that need to be operated within this system. So this is not pick and lift. This is product that has to go from manufacture to the patient under certain conditions. And there's a rigour in the industry to their quality systems and their logistics. So that's a really important piece. And they have been solving this problem and telling us of their progress over the course of all of our Brexit preparations and giving us good reassurance throughout that process. In relation to sterling, I guess it might help Deputy Donnelly's point around how far our euro-dollar will get next year.
Help my colleague.
I think I haven't yet seen the scenario where there's an appreciation in sterling in the event of a no-deal crash out. So you would expect the euro, the purchasing power of the euro, to be stronger in that situation. It's not something that we're hoping for, but in that situation, I think it's not a currency that would be moving against us in that situation.
I think it's something you should keep in mind, Madam Chairperson, because it will have a bearing on the sourcing of supplies eventually. The next question is, are there any situations where the EU standards are below the British standards? None whatsoever.
No, because the British standards today are the EU standards.
Yes, that's okay.
Yeah.
That's good. That's good. And there's no change in that. Can I ask in relation to, the ideal situation is that the island of Ireland would apply the single market rules and we'd be given that way out, and that the customs union would apply to the island of Ireland. That is particularly important in relation to food supplies. And my question is, to what degree have you been in contact with the distributors and impossible importers or exporters? Because the Northern Ireland suppliers and the Northern Ireland distributors have a vested interest in keeping the highest possible standards applicable in the island of Ireland. That's in their interest. And if you talk with the Northern Ireland, the Ulster farmers, they will very quickly tell you that they are inextricably linked with the South and with the European Union, where the highest standards apply. So that then brings us to the situation, ports and airports. The extent to which you have been in contact with ports and airport authorities and the customs people in such places, with a view to ensuring that a dumping of product from lower standard economies on a global scale, arriving in the UK and being offloaded onto the island of Ireland, that it doesn't happen, because the standards that must apply here will have to apply, obviously, in the north of Ireland, and more especially in their interest.
Yes.
So are you doing that? Have you been in touch with them?
Yes, absolutely. So the Northern Ireland relationship is between the Food Safety Authority of Ireland and their counterparts in Northern Ireland, and there is a very strong mission shared between them in relation to food safety standards. In relation to ports, particularly ports, but ports and airports, an interagency approach has been taken. So the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, the HSE, Food Safety Authority of Ireland, and importantly the Revenue Commissioners as their customs operation. So the logistical planning of the operation of the ports is being led by the Revenue Commissioners, but we have built into it the staffing capacity to scale up our existing inspection processes in those ports. It's important to say that third country products, even third country product that is coming from wherever around the world into Dublin Port, is currently subject to food controls and inspection on a risk-rated basis. That would apply to east-west trade if the UK leaves, and we will have the personnel in place to upscale the inspection capacity without impacting the flow through the port as and from the date that the UK leave, if it is without an agreement.
And have you also provided for the necessity to increase the number of inspections of all such product? I've had numerous questions put down on that issue from time to time.
Yeah, so very much so. So the methodology here would be that the documentation will be lodged by the person who's importing. We'll take Dublin Port. That will be lodged in advance of them getting on to the ferry. So say in Holyhead, they will have lodged their documentation. The documentation will be assessed, including in respect of food items, as to whether they're risk rated for inspection. The Revenue Commissioners will send a message to the haulier on the ferry that they will have to go to an inspection point to be inspected. They might be inspected by the Department of Agriculture and Food if it was meat products. They might be inspected by Customs if they had an interest, or they might be inspected by HSE environmental health staff in respect of certain food items.
And you're happy that sufficient resources are in place to ensure an adequate cover in those circumstances, and recognising that product coming from the European Union, directly from the European Union, not through a third country, but directly from the European Union, that the inspections at EU level all around are adequate to give the kind of assurance that you are happy to give?
So we're working on the basis of adequacy. We are working in terms of currently product from third countries, it's risk rated. We will be doing the same in this situation. We'll be deciding based on the category of food that's involved what the risk attaching to it is, and we will be inspecting those. We have much of the 10 million euros I've mentioned has been invested in the Environmental Health Service so that they have additional staffing. So we will have inspections in place from day one, and we will have to review that and build on it over the period ahead.
To what degree have you made alternative arrangements in the cases where sensitive and urgently required supplies, maybe small quantities but important quantities, coming from a number of sources, perhaps from the UK, not necessarily being sourced in the UK? Do you have an ability to alternate your source of supply in all cases, particularly where a serious health risk might arise? In other words, to be able to fly the product very quickly from another location, which within an hour, 2 hours, can arrive here.
Yes, one of the things we have is we have worked with the Revenue Commissioners in a situation where we're trying to fast-track something through a port. We will have advanced notice with the Revenue Commissioners that their inspections or any delays on their end won't apply, and it will be fast-tracked up in through that because of the sensitive nature of those products. But more generally, as we've explored, in many situations we don't have single supplier products. In many situations we have therapeutic areas where different types of products can be used depending on availability, and that's a situation that we currently manage, where a shortage arises for a particularly proprietary product, that we look at alternatives or we look at different sourcing mechanisms. We also have the ability within our system to make sure that whatever product we do hold in Ireland is used in the most effective way possible. So the HPRA would have experience in a situation where we're running into a short supply. It's not that we don't have any product, but we're running into a short supply. We have product for a period. The important thing is that all of that product is available and available for the most effective usage, and that we don't have product sitting somewhere that's not being used.
In the event of there being a shortage of particular sensitive supplies in Northern Ireland, have you any arrangement to cooperate with them in the opposite direction, as it were?
John might just...
Yes, we do. We work very closely with our colleagues in the north and indeed across the UK. But in particular with Brexit, we've made arrangements with our counterparts from a logistics point of view. If there's difficulties either way, that we can assist each other.
Thank you. And in relation to again, going back to the assurances, you mentioned assurances in the opening statement. Assurances in relation to supplies sourced in the UK or sourced outside and coming via the UK. Have you, in all cases, made alternative arrangements in the event of the assurances being undeliverable?
So, like, the generality here is you have to risk rate what the issue arising is. So if we have 8 to 10 weeks of stock, the important thing, and we've discussed this with the industry, the important thing is that the industry doesn't wait till the final week to replenish that stock, that they replenish it on an ongoing basis. So even in a situation where there are delays, for example, on the Dover-Calais Straits, even in that situation where there are delays of a number of days, we would still be getting product through over that 8 to 10 week period. The important thing is that everybody works to the worst case scenario and anticipates any issues that arises and replenishes as we go, rather than waiting till the problem arises.
The treatment purchase scheme, you mentioned that at the outset as well, that provision is made for that to continue. to Northern Ireland and vice versa. And what about the UK? Does that apply to the UK still as well?
Yes, I can ask Maurice and Paula to talk to the detail of it, but we have on foot at the legislation that was passed earlier this year, we have agreement underway with the UK to facilitate, using the common travel area, the kind of reciprocation that we currently enjoy between us. So, for example, on the treatment abroad scheme, we currently send, or in 2018 we sent 590 patients to the UK, whereas we sent just 73 to Europe outside of the UK. That's predominantly England, those 590. There's only 37 of those that are going to Northern Ireland. They're generally going for specialist treatment, and we have an understanding at the highest levels that both countries are committed to continuing with that. And then the HSE has individual relationships with the particular service providers that are delivering those services, and they have reinforced that in the run-up as part of our Brexit preparations. You're probably also interested in the cross-border treatment, and in the cross-border treatment, 6,308 on a provisional basis people went to the UK under the cross-border directive in 2018. Just 420 went outside of the UK but to the rest of Europe, predominantly about half of that to Poland. So 6,308, of which the majority in fact go to Northern Ireland for ophthalmics, orthopaedics and so on. And again, as part of our arrangements with the UK authorities, we have signalled and we have provided for in the legislation that we wish to continue with that, and they are happy to facilitate us in that.
Okay, so as our witnesses have been here for 2 hours, I'm obligated to offer them the opportunity to take a break if need be. I'm also conscious of time, and there are people coming into this room after us, so do you wish to take a break?
What do you think is left, Chair? It'll help us to make the call.
Don't be looking at me. I'm very brief.
And come with the last questions.
Oh, okay, so Deputy Durkan has a few questions. Deputy Donnelly, have you follow-up questions?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Deputy O'Connell?
Maybe 3 minutes, maybe nothing.
Okay, well, I will absolutely hold them to that.
So I'm happy to stay. If people need to leave,
we all agreed happy to stay. Okay,
yeah.
that's fine. That's fine.
Quarter past, maybe we can make it a quarter past. That's 20 minutes.
Deputy Durkan, if you'd like to conclude with your questions, have you finished?
I don't want you to answer this question in a way that might come back to trip you again. But in the course of your negotiations and your deliberations with the various bodies that you've liaised with in the past 12 months or more, there will be one or more or several about which you have some concerns and about which you are not happy. And obviously, I'm not asking you to tell me what they might be for obvious reasons. But what I am asking you is this: have you put in place an alternative to deal with those situations in any set of circumstances? And I can think of several of them, and I'm sure you can as well. But it is a hugely important issue from the point of view of the medical sector and the health sector in this and the food sector in this country.
Yeah, I might ask the HBRA as regulator just to talk to that, but I will give you the general overview of that, because we've been at this a long time. The original concern was that people didn't think this was going to happen, and while there was a lot of talk about it, something would happen to come to the rescue. Without being facetious, I think some of the developments that we've seen in recent months have added to, have taken from the complacency around this, and people have been very exercised across this year in seeing Brexit as a real threat, not just to public health, but to their business and the need for them to get that sorted. There is a piece of the final preparation that somebody makes, particularly where it's going to cost significant amounts of money. People have done a lot of work up to that final trigger and have been operating on the basis, well, maybe a deal will be arrived at. The important thing is that they have a readiness to make any changes that they need to make, and they do that on a timely basis. And we have been stressing to people to advance plan all of this and to do it as speedily as possible, and not work on the basis that something is going to come to the rescue and this is all going to go away, because that is not a safe presumption for any contingency planning. But I might ask Lorraine just to talk to the kind of detailed engagement.
Yeah, no problem, Jim. Look, even from my opening statement, Deputy Durkan, it's clear that we have had a very long and extensive period of engagement with all of the stakeholders involved. And just to put this in context, I mean, there's 7,000 medicines authorised for supply in our market. We have contacted the marketing authorisation holders for all of those products, not just once, on many occasions. We've also engaged with all of the wholesalers, and they have given us their reassurances that they are looking at everything they need to put in place and they're planning in relation to Brexit. They are also looking at their contingencies, and as Jim has mentioned, you know, in terms of dependencies they may have on the UK land or transport, that I have identified alternative routes. These are very sophisticated companies. Logistics is absolutely key and central to the viability of their businesses. So, you know, they have high levels of expertise in relation to anticipating and planning in relation to this. So I think, you know, from the point of view of what everything that we can do and everything that we are anticipating, we are doing that. And we will continue to do that until the deadline or until whatever stage the UK exits on as well too. Having said that, you know, things can happen. I do think the cooperation that we have developed between ourselves, the Department and the HSE, and the mechanisms we have in place through the operations group, the criticality assessment, and then coming into the existing systems we have from a regulatory viewpoint in terms of our shortages framework, have really strengthened our intelligence capability. So, you know, I would be confident that we can anticipate, and I would be confident we have systems in place to manage what may happen. But there are many unknowns in relation to Brexit, and I have to be honest in saying to that. I have also used the phrase in my opening statement, there are no guarantees. But insofar as we can anticipate, I believe we have done that. And I also believe we have developed a very good methodology to be able to manage the situations that may arise over the next while.
Thank you. Deputy Donnelly, your 5 minutes starts.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Breslin, I just want to go back specifically to the cross-border directive, because it's in place right now. We're 26 working days away from God knows what. My understanding is what you're saying is there is an agreement in place that is an active agreement such that on day 27 people will be able to continue to go to Belfast, to Derry, wherever it is. They will pay for their treatment as they currently do, and the HSE will reimburse them when they come back. Can you just confirm that that is the case and that there now is an agreement in writing in place between the two governments that will continue?
Yes, so there's the legislation, there's the overarching memorandum of understanding that was signed between Minister Coveney and his counterpart, and we have a drafted agreement between ourselves and the UK, which will be signed on the day that not the first day, but the last day before they go out, and all of that work is in place.
Thank you very much. I want to ask you just about some of the work that is going on. Mr. Breslin, in your statement on page 7, it says, strong general assurances have been received from industry, but an expert group is also examining categories of medicine where it is deemed especially important to work directly with suppliers to verify robust contingencies. And various of the members here are still using the current tense, right? So we are examining categories, yes. We are looking at supply chains. Again, we're 26 working days away. When will you be moving from we are examining to we have examined? When will this work be done to your satisfaction?
We will continue to examine, because, for example, for the end of March, we had to examine it in the preceding period before that, and we are now going back and refreshing that. And even in the event of a Brexit, we would continue to monitor the market. So it won't be a final one-off exercise that we'll say, oh, they were compliant in May or they were compliant in June. We will ensure and verify compliance right up to the point of departure, and in fact beyond, for the most risky areas.
Okay. Excuse me. Thank you. The final question then is a follow-on. We've been here for hours, and it sounds like an enormous amount of work has been done and continues to be done, and it sounds like good work. It sounds like good multi-agency work, which we don't always have conversations about when it comes to healthcare at committee. So I just want to ask one more time. I've asked the question, but if I could just give an example of Mr. Sullivan, in your statement on page 2, you say the number of medical devices that will have regulatory issues is significant and represents a particular risk to maintaining service continuity from early 2020. And on page 3, you say, with regard to medicine, there remains a potential for delay and disruption to supply routes. And then on page 4, you say, a no-deal Brexit still has the potential to cause disruption to health services, and that's fine. My understanding of what we've been told today is that there are no specific risks right now, that the breadth of the work that you have done has looked at all of the medicines, looked at all of the devices, looked at regulation of qualifications and so forth. And that your position right now is, of course, things may happen. And we are in the world of unintended consequences and unknown unknowns. And you are therefore reasonably caveating your statements. But am I right in thinking that at present you don't have a short list of specific risks where you think things are more likely to go wrong? Essentially, the sense I'm getting is, come the 1st of November, things are going to carry on. They may not, but there's nothing left that you have on your plates that says, however, we do think the following 2 or 3 disruptions are likely to occur. So can I just ask a final time, do you have specific risks that you're still concerned about? Do you have specific devices, for example, that you are concerned about?
I'm not being pedantic, but I do want to just unpick the word risk, because once you risk rate, you will risk rate in terms of impact. What if we didn't have it? And you'll risk based on vulnerability. If I could use a different terminology, we don't have a current concern that there will be, on day 1, week 1, this product not available to us. Yeah. We have products that, because of the nature of them, we will be looking and monitoring them very intensively over the period, and we require and have put in place a number of contingencies to guard against any issues. So there is risk, but it's not a risk that we are saying is of current concern that says to us we have a shortage that we have to deal with at this point in time. And if I could just
and just on that, Service President, and that applies across
so if I just link then what Dean Sullivan's opening statement said on medical devices, which is that the notified bodies and the fact that they haven't got all of the products that have UK notified bodies, haven't got a new EU notified body behind them. We need to link that up with what the HPRA and the Department is saying, which is that the engagement of all of us is with those suppliers to become compliant. And that's at the fore of where the European Commission are saying you have to become compliant. But in a situation where Europe-wide we have products that are required for healthcare and have public health implications, that up to the last day have a full CE mark signed off by a European member state, but on day 1 there is now an issue over that, then our Minister has said, and we have said, and the HPRA have said in Brussels, we need to problem solve that as a European system, and we need to come up with a solution to that. So it's not a supply issue, it's a regulation issue, but we will be making our voice very clear. I understand why that decision won't be made until the end of this process. So to make it 6 months out, you give people no incentive to comply. But we will have to look at that in that situation and look at the implications of it. And ourselves as a member state, but other member states will have a view on that and will be seeking to come up with a solution.
All right.
Thank you, Mr.
Well,
President.
thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Now, Deputy O'Connell, your 3 minutes starts now.
Thank you. So, in terms of the stockpiling issue, which is probably the word that's in everybody's head, we're not stockpiling medicines in this country because we have headroom of normal supply. That the up to 12 weeks headroom, that can be replenished in the intervening period. The only issue really is devices, and that's a historic issue because of the piggybacking on the UK regulations. But we are stockpiling to some extent surgical packs and things, but that's because of the device element, not the drug element. Isn't that right? She's only going to give me 3 minutes.
Yeah,
so.
to avoid terminology taking flight.
I just don't want the wrong message to go out of
There
here.
is a question in any distribution system about the buffer that's held.
Yeah.
And we have a very significant buffer on the medicines, and we've always had that, and we have a very significant buffer on the medical devices. At a national level, the HSE, on a specific product basis, may make a decision to increase that buffer for medical devices, and that's where the HSE is.
So,
but that's quite different to individuals, or even service providers, hospitals, pharmacists and so on, making a decision on that.
Yeah. And in terms of devices, just getting back to the insulin patients, the needles for testing your blood and the lancets, they're classed a device, aren't they? So how are we okay for them? For diabetic testing? Yes, we're okay for them. And then for the 2020 May regulations that are coming for devices, is it nothing to do with Brexit? Is it envisaged that it will be the HPRA and the EMA that will take on the 39 categories? Is it, you know, it's not really an authorised product, so I know you're helping out in this regard now, but I assume it won't be subsumed into your work in the HPRA. I'm just asking.
I suppose we need another session to go into this in detail, just being honest right up front, but in the couple of minutes that remain, just quickly, the EMA have no role in relation to the regulation of medical devices, so that's first. It is a notified body system. It's a decentralised approach. We as an organisation don't issue certificates for devices. They are issued by certification organisations throughout Europe. What is happening is we are transitioning to a new regulatory regime which enhances the standards those notified bodies have to comply with. So from a notified body viewpoint, you can imagine their quality systems, their resourcing, all of that is being raised and being elevated in standard. That takes time. So that's the complexity for them when they've been asked to accept certification activities that were previously conducted by the UK to bring them in. They're struggling with capacity issues in it. It can be managed, and that is the one thing to say about the regulatory system Jim has outlined. We'd be confident that a European solution can be found. If it cannot be found on a national level, we can make decisions as a regulator and working with those companies to bring them into compliance. You know, I have spoken about the fact that the risk that these present, you know, it's the same regulatory system on the 31st of October as it is on the 1st of November. And we will, whatever it takes to keep continuity of care going, we will do that. We will work with the companies. The risk may be over time that commercially, because of uncertainty, that may change whether manufacturers will supply the marketplace or not. But that is a problem we have with Brexit in the generality of it.
Just finally, so if there is a hard Brexit and there is a particular drug, not device, drug, that is produced in the UK, it can no longer seamlessly come into our country. The batch will have to be tested for release onto the European market. Have we the qualified persons in place here? Have we discussed this the last time, I think, to some extent?
We have, and you're absolutely right. First of all, the European Commission has given a derogation until the end of this year, so that testing that's currently performed in the UK continues to be tested in the UK, and that is a transition agreement. The industry has made very good progress in relation to transferring regulatory activities that were conducted in the UK, so that would be the location of the marketing authorisation holder, the testing and the batch released activities to EU27. Ireland has actually received a lot of those transfers. We haven't received them all. They have also gone to other European countries. But that work has been very, very much so in train over the last number of months. There are still levels of non-compliance, but the industry is continuing to work towards theirs, and I imagine as the deadline approaches, we will see a big push in that way. There may be issues with the testing, and I'm being honest with the committee in relation to that, because for some complex medicines, like biological medicines that are proteins, etc., the relocation and the finding of a facility in Europe may not be as easy, and then there is competition for contract laboratory space. It will depend on where we end up across the European system in relation to this. Again, a European solution will probably be determined if it's necessary. If not, it can be managed on a national basis, and we can work with companies towards compliance on that as well.
Thank you. And I just want to clarify, Deputy O'Connell was given 3 minutes because she asked for 3 minutes. I just want to be really clear on that. So on behalf of the committee, I want to thank all of our witnesses. I'm not going to name you all, but thank you to every single one of you for coming in today, for your open engagement and indeed for the work that you're doing and continue to do in this regard. Certainly none of us looked for it, but we do appreciate the efforts made to mitigate the potential damage. As there is no other business, this meeting of the Joint Committee is now adjourned until next Wednesday, the 2nd of October. Thank you.